The global knit and crochet market is expected to grow by $10.6 billion between 2024 and 2028, and crochet is just really trendy right now. In order to keep up with demand, fast fashion retailers have chosen to exploit garment workers and other creators of artistic crochet so that they can supply garments to the masses. Today, we're going to go into detail about why you should not choose to purchase crochet from fast fashion sites and the other ways that these websites are exploiting creators. Before we get into detail, I wanted to discuss and just briefly touch on every single garment that we wear is made by human hands. So even if it's not a crochet or knitted item from fast fashion, the items that cost like less than $10, less than $5 from fast fashion retailers, from Shein and Temu, they're all made by human hands, and none of them are made in the best circumstances for the workers. A lot of them work in sweatshops and are exploited, and I don't want to glaze over that fact when talking about specifically crochet today. It's important to consider that everything we purchase is made by human hands. But today we are going to go into detail about specifically crochet fast fashion. So let's quickly talk statistics. I kind of want to give some context to how big of an issue this has become globally. I did a little research and I found out that according to this one website I found, from the period of March 2023 to March 2024, there were more than 26,000 active crochet exporters globally. And some countries obviously have, dozens and dozens of different crochet factories, and they exported to 209 different countries, and there were a total of 118,000 different crochet export shipments made. And who's to say how many pieces each shipment had? So that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of crochet items being exported and imported all across the world. And that's just the statistics for crochet items. That's not even touching all of the rest of the fast fashion items that we're kind of not going to get into detail much about today. Today we're specifically focusing on crochet. That's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of crochet items that have been exported and imported globally. And this can be ranging from a full garment in crochet all the way down to a keychain, or say a pocket is a crochet granny square pocket. That really ranges across the board. So there are full crochet items being sold, full crochet blankets being sold, and there are also just sort of tchotchkes being sold that are crocheted as well. And hats, bucket hats are trendy. Pretty much anything that you can think of is being exported right now through these global factories. And I know that I myself crochet. I knitted this shirt, and I would never sell a crochet garment that I've made or a knitted garment that I've made for less than $30, let alone honestly maybe less than $300. But if you look on Shein and Temu and Romwe, these websites, a lot of these garments are being sold for less than $10, or some of them around $5. And so it's really important to consider just realistically, right? Practically, if you look at that garment and somebody made each stitch by hand, you know that objectively there's no way that the garment maker was paid fairly, because it takes hours to make these garments. And even being paid $5 for the garment, you're being paid maybe 50 cents an hour, most likely more like 8 cents an hour. We're going to get into more detail about that, but really just objectively, there's no way to confidently say that these garment workers were being paid fairly for their labor. When it comes to knitting, each stitch is connected to the last using a series of loops. Knitting only has two basic stitches, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. These stitches are created by pulling the yarn through the front or back of the loop below it. A pretty simple maneuver for a machine to replicate using just a little hook. The stitches are two-dimensional, meaning the yarn only has to go through the back or front of the stitch one time in order to create the next stitch. You can't skip a stitch in knitting without accounting for the loop below it, or else the fabric will unravel. So all in all, knitting is two-dimensional, and it's pretty straightforward to replicate because all the yarn has to do is go through the front or back of the loop, depending on whether you want to create a knit or purl stitch. Even if you're doing something more intricate like cables or lacework, or decreases or increases, all you really have to do is pull the yarn through the front or back of the loop below it. However, crochet has about 5 basic stitches, and then more than that, there's over 150 ways that you can combine crochet stitches to make completely different looks and appearances for your craft. You can also start crocheting anywhere you want on an item, meaning if you stop crocheting and cut the yarn, then you can take your hook and start anywhere else on the project that you'd like without causing an interference with the previous stitches. Each crochet stitch typically also requires you to pull the yarn through the stitch more than one time, making a three-dimensional stitch rather than a flat stitch like you do with knitting. Similarly, each crochet stitch has to be completely finished before you can move on to the next one. So unlike knitting, where you have all your stitches kind of hanging out on your needle waiting for you to come back to them, with crochet you have to completely finish a stitch before you can move on to the next one, because otherwise you'll have 6 or 7 loops on your hook and you won't be able to tie off the yarn in any way. You can't just move on to the next with all your loops still on your hook, unlike knitting, where you're kind of supposed to. So crochet and knitting are actually very, very different structurally. Even though they are kind of lumped together and they're both yarn crafts, the end result is a completely different fabric and structure of the stitch. And the ability to recreate knitting by machine has been around for about 200 years, and the ability to create crochet by machine has just never existed. Either way, not to get too technical about it, all that really boils down to is that every single garment found in the fast fashion warehouses that's crochet is made entirely and completely by human hands, every single stitch. So like I mentioned earlier, I do want to touch on this again. Every single garment that we wear is made by human hands, including fast fashion, cheap garments, including really high-end designer garments. Every single garment we wear was sewn by an individual person, and I don't want to overlook that. So let's quickly discuss sweatshops. Unfortunately, fair pay and healthy working conditions really aren't on the table when it comes to crochet fast fashion and generally fast fashion. Workers are typically paid by piece. So what that means is that instead of being paid an hourly or a salary wage, they're paid per piece they complete. And this incentivizes workers to work 18-hour days, take barely any time off, really barely spend any time with their families, and they are incentivized to be making as much money as they can because they're often not paid anywhere close to the minimum wage or living wage in their country. So what that means is maybe they make 5 cents per piece they complete or 8 cents per piece they complete. And, you know, if you are crocheting and you work an 18-hour day, really you can not necessarily complete more than 2 garments, maybe at most. So the pay is really, really, really low for those working in these factories. And I wanted to go into one study that I found. So let's talk about sweatshops a little bit. So in 2022, an undercover investigation was done in the UK on the brand Shein, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with that brand. And the Business and Human Rights Resource Center published a report stating that the Chinese garment workers worked 18-hour days with only about 1 day off per month. They had an undercover investigation done, which I think is kind of cool. And what they discovered was honestly horrifying. The working conditions that they found these women working in were abysmal, and unfortunately, most of the children that were laboring in these companies, they were doing the embroidery. So what that means basically is that the women were working 18-hour days, they had 1 day a month off, they were working in tiny cramped environments, and like I said, they were incentivized to work as much as they possibly could with really no reason not to, because they weren't able to financially support themselves unless they like broke their backs. And in other countries, there are child labor laws, obviously. There are laws to protect people from terrible working conditions, fire hazards, and a lot of these laws have come about due to workers having previously had terrible conditions and unions kind of rallying against them. But unfortunately, in a lot of the countries that are kind of used for exporting labor like this, like Bangladesh and China and Singapore, the laws have not been passed in the same way as in the West, so the workers are completely unprotected by labor laws. So again, according to the British Business and Human Rights Resource Center, they also did a study on workers in Bangladesh, and they found that each worker earned about $500 US a month, which equated to about 2 cents per piece of clothing that they made, which obviously is completely, like, you're not able to support your family on that. And they found that the minimum wage only ranged from about a half to a fifth of the living wage required for a family to meet its basic needs. So even if a woman was working 18-hour days with 1 day a month off, she was only able to provide for about a fifth to half of the family's basic needs. And that's just, like, obviously not going to get it done. Mexico and Central America also have a rich history of textile production. The Mayans were creating textiles, and now, still today, they are very much known for textile production. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about crochet exports from specifically Mexico. I did like a little light Googling, and I found that the first 10 results-ish were companies in Mexico that were crochet manufacturers trying to encourage people to use their companies to mass produce crochet garments, which I thought was kind of fascinating. It took me a little bit more digging to find the actual information about exports from Mexico, but I was able to find it. And what I found was that in Mexico, there were a total of 1,870 total crochet suppliers, and they exported to 1,061 buyers between March 2023 and February 2024. So Mexico is not actually that big of a place, right? But they still had 1,800 crochet suppliers exporting goods, which is, to me, crazy. That's a lot of just companies in general exporting crochet stuff. And the biggest purchaser of these exports was Levi Strauss. Unfortunately, factory workers being paid fairly is not just a problem overseas, but also in the United States. In 2022, California passed the Garment Worker Protection Act, which established a couple new rules that factories had to follow in order to keep their doors open. One of these rules was that factories were required to pay their workers the state-mandated minimum wage rather than pay them by piece. So as I touched on earlier, many garment factories choose to pay their workers per piece of or per garment completed rather than per hour. And this resulted in workers in Los Angeles, California being paid as little as $2.68 per hour with an average of $5.85 per hour. And I don't know what the minimum wage is in California, but I know here in Maryland it's $15-ish per hour. So that's a significantly less amount than they would be making minimum wage here in Maryland or in California as well. And now factories are required to pay the state-mandated minimum wage. The other rule that this bill established is that brands and retailers and factories are equally liable for issues that come up with garment workers in the factory. So if the factory workers aren't being paid fairly, or if there's a liability issue going on, the brand and retailers that purchase from the factory are responsible and can be sued just as the factory can. This liability measure really de-incentivizes brands and retailers from purchasing from sweatshop-like conditions because they just don't want to get sued. So this is the first bill globally that has been passed anything close to this. And so there's a lot of room for improvement both within the US, each state could easily pass a bill like this, and abroad. And there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to global child labor laws and other things of that nature too. Large retailers are also stealing designs from Instagram crocheters and knitters for mass reproduction. So I know this comes up on Craftsnark and my Instagram stories. Honestly, every month or so, there's a new small designer who's advocating for themselves and letting people know that Shein or Temu has stolen one of their ideas and replicated it mass production-wise. And there's really nothing that a small designer can do besides advocate for themselves on the internet in order to get their design taken down. So the large company knows, right? If they steal a design from a small designer, there's really no way the designer has the financial or emotional resources to advocate for themselves enough to really do anything about it. They're not going to get fairly compensated financially for the fact that their design was stolen. They're not going to get really any traction besides people advocating for them on the internet anonymously. And ultimately, the huge conglomerate company definitely has the upper hand, and they know this, which is why they steal designs. So it's just very slimy and icky for these large companies to steal small crochet and knitting designers' ideas. Obviously, it's very, very slimy. On top of that, if the company does manage to hear the small designer and take the design off their website, the likelihood is that the design has already been mass produced. So there is an environmental impact to taking the design off the website. The likelihood is that there's 1,000 or 5,000 of these stolen items sitting in a warehouse somewhere rotting, or not rotting if it's acrylic. And there is an environmental impact to the design theft as well, which is kind of, again, just really slimy behavior by these large companies to steal these little designers' ideas when they know that the designer just really can't clap back in any way. On top of that, mass production of original ideas undervalues the price of handmade crochet items. Why would anybody buy the item for $300 or for its actual value per hour or per heart put into the item when they could just buy it online for like $6.99? There's really no reason that the public would understand why handmade items are so expensive when they can buy an almost identical item for less than 20 bucks. It really kind of skews the public's perception of handcraft and how much things are worth when the price online is so insanely cheap. Ultimately, the easy conclusion to come to is that one should not purchase fast fashion crochet or really fast fashion clothing of any kind. And I don't want to shame anybody who, I know people have different budgets and limited budgets, and you got to do what you got to do, but I really do hope to kind of help people consider mindfully when they purchase clothing, where they're getting it from, and maybe take this as an opportunity to learn to crochet. If you really want that granny square tank top or that granny square cardigan, just really consider where all of our clothing comes from, because every single garment is made by human hands.